Very devastated, according to reports in Australia, over basically the continued debate over security. Every trip becomes overshadowed. Apparently, it was an Australian MP named David Limbrick who started the conversation. He wants Harry and Meghan to fully reimburse police for the added security that they provided them throughout a clearly commercial venture.
The pressure around security costs in Australia hit a nerve many people feel has been building for a long time. When Australian MP David Limbrick pushed for Harry and Meghan to reimburse Victoria Police for protection tied to what critics called a commercial-style tour, it sparked a much bigger debate. It wasn't just about security anymore. It became about responsibility, funding, and who should cover the costs when private citizens take part in high-profile public events wrapped in a humanitarian image. Reports suggested Harry was deeply frustrated by the renewed attention on security, with insiders describing exhaustion over the issue surfacing again. From his perspective, this is a battle he has been trying to address for years, and every new trip seems to bring the same arguments back into the spotlight. That frustration is easy to understand on a personal level. Harry has repeatedly framed security as a serious safety matter, arguing that without proper protection, travel for him and his family carries real concerns, especially in Commonwealth nations where visibility and public interest remain high. The review surrounding these security arrangements is still unresolved, and because of that, every major international appearance seems to reopen the same questions. But Australia made the debate feel even more intense. This isn't just any stop on a world tour. This is a Commonwealth country where the monarchy still carries constitutional weight, and that changes how many people view the issue.
Sources say Harry is frustrated, despairing, and devastated due to the added attention to this matter. I mean, when is he not? That's just typical Tuesday for our boy.
That is why critics focus so heavily on who funded the police support during the visit. Federal and state resources were used to protect two people who are no longer working royals, while the tour itself included appearances many observers said blurred the line between charitable outreach and brand-building opportunities. And that's where things got complicated fast. The retreat promotions, fashion attention surrounding public appearances, the Bondi Beach Memorial stop, the MasterChef appearance, all of it fed a wider argument that this was not being viewed simply as a traditional humanitarian tour. For some commentators, that changed the entire conversation, because once commercial elements appear tied to a visit, the question becomes much sharper. Should public resources fund protection connected to activities seen by critics as partly private or promotional in nature? That is the question the Australian MP raised, and it resonated because it touched something larger than one trip. It raised the broader institutional issue that has followed Harry and Meghan for years, where public duty, private ventures, and royal association often seem to overlap in ways that keep generating controversy. Supporters argue security should never become politicized, and that protection should be viewed through a safety lens first. Critics argue taxpayers deserve answers when public resources are involved. And that clash is exactly why this story keeps growing. Working royals traditionally receive government-backed protection because they carry out official duties tied directly to the institution.
Do you think that the suggestion is fair? I think that if Harry and Meghan would have been there and they would have been working exclusively with charities, it's one thing to have the public pay for them, but Meghan and Harry had multiple commercial ventures. Meghan's, I don't know whether we'll talk about it at great length or not, but, Meghan coddling cancer-stricken children with the outfit she's wearing up for sale within minutes on.
That model is understood. But once people step outside that formal role while still operating in spaces connected to royal symbolism, many say the lines become harder to define. And that's what made Australia such a flashpoint. It wasn't only about security vehicles or police presence, it became about whether old royal expectations are colliding with a very different post-royal reality. Some observers say this issue has become one of the most difficult, unresolved questions in Harry's public life. Because unlike media criticism or image battles, this touches law, government spending, protocol, and public perception, all at once. And every time the issue resurfaces, it seems to deepen the same tension. Harry appears to see the debate through the lens of family protection and fairness. Critics often frame it through accountability and public cost. Those are very different lenses, and they rarely meet in the middle. What also made the Australian reaction stand out was the timing. The tour appeared designed to reinforce positive visibility, strengthen public goodwill, and generate momentum.
Meghan's not only receiving these for free, then making commission off of sales related to them, but like Catherine's purchasing with a budget.
Instead, the security debate pulled attention in a completely different direction. Rather than headlines focusing only on appearances and outreach, much of the discussion shifted back to funding, entitlement, and institutional privilege. For critics, that was damaging. For supporters, it looked like another example of the couple facing scrutiny no matter what they do. But either way, the security question refused to stay in the background. And maybe that's because it touches a question nobody has fully answered. If former working royals continue operating in spaces shaped by royal status, but outside official royal structures, what rules apply? Who pays? Who decides? And where does public duty end while private enterprise begins? Those questions have hovered for years, but in Australia they came roaring back into focus because once an elected official publicly raises reimbursement demands, the conversation moves beyond tabloid chatter into political debate, and that gives the issue a whole different weight. For many watching, that was the real story. Not just police costs, but what those costs symbolized. The unresolved tension between monarchy, independence, privilege, and public accountability. And until those questions are clearly settled, many believe every future Commonwealth visit could trigger the same storm all over again.
I think she had time to attend it. She just seemed to be permanently changing clothes. I mean, it was a sort of, almost like those sort of quick scene changes in theatre. Suddenly the, quick scene change off the stage door, come out wearing something else.
The security debate goes even deeper when people start asking, what protection is really tied to? For working royals, protection has traditionally been seen as part of public service, a cost carried by the institution because the work is tied to national interest. But critics say once Harry and Meghan stepped outside that official framework while continuing high-profile appearances with commercial elements, the question became much harder to ignore. That is where this debate keeps getting more intense. If protection comes through public resources, some argue taxpayers are indirectly supporting activities seen as partly commercial. If the costs are private, then reports about massive annual security expenses raise another question altogether. How sustainable is that over time? And that's why the reimbursement demand in Australia landed with such force. It wasn't only about one trip, it became a direct political expression of a much larger, unresolved issue. Then another layer made the story even more explosive: the fashion controversy. Commentary surrounding clothing connected to the Australia visit raised questions about whether humanitarian imagery and commercial value were blending in ways critics found troubling. Reports claimed several Australian designers provided outfits for visibility, hoping association with Meghan would boost exposure. And that is where scrutiny intensified. According to those reports, clothing worn at charitable appearances was later linked through shopping platforms that could generate commission revenue. That detail sparked major reactions because critics argued it blurred the line between philanthropy and monetization in a way people were not expecting.
That strikes me as very unrealistic when it doesn't seem like the UK is where Meghan Markle wants to be, and I don't think she'd want her children so far away from her.
For many observers, the issue wasn't simply receiving designer clothing. Public figures have relationships with fashion houses all the time. It was the timing and setting that drove debate, because some of these looks were tied to emotionally sensitive appearances, and that made people ask tougher questions. Critics argued that when clothing associated with visits to hospitals or memorial spaces also carries possible commercial upside, the symbolism changes. Suddenly, what looks like outreach to some begins to look to others like branding wrapped in service, and that is where comparisons with Catherine exploded across coverage. Many pointed to the long-standing distinction around her wardrobe, often framed as part of public duty rather than personal revenue. The argument wasn't about fashion itself, but about whether clothing serves image, institution, or commerce. Supporters of that view say Catherine's style creates attention for designers but does not function as a personal business channel. Critics claim that creates a sharp contrast with what they see in Meghan's approach, where public appearances and brand visibility sometimes seem more intertwined. For some commentators, this represented the old royal line many say the institution has tried to maintain for decades: service on one side, commerce on the other. And that's why this became bigger than clothes. It became another chapter in a much wider debate about whether those boundaries have been crossed. Then the conversation shifted again, this time toward Prince George and the future. Reports about William and Catherine considering secondary school options for George added a very different dimension, but many saw a connection. Because
I would say Prince William seems happier because he still has some of those contacts and people he can trust and rely on. And then alternatively, you have Harry kind of, what are the rudderless, I love when you say that, rudderless.
It revived discussion about how the Waleses are perceived to handle institutional decisions quietly, privately, and without turning personal family matters into public theatre. For supporters, that approach reflects stability. School choices are discussed as family decisions, not public spectacle. And that contrast has fueled even more comparisons. Observers have often pointed to how George, Charlotte, and Louis have been shielded from excessive exposure, with their school lives kept largely private. For many, that has become part of the image surrounding William and Catherine: duty with strong boundaries. And once those comparisons started, they quickly expanded into Harry's own reported feelings about Britain. Claims that Harry may want his children to experience parts of British life that shaped him added a more personal layer to the story. Boarding school, lifelong friendships, the social circles formed in those years. Some commentators say those memories still hold emotional weight for him. That idea caught attention because it suggests something deeper than headlines or public disputes. It hints at longing, identity, maybe even a pull toward a life he feels distance from. Whether any relocation talk is realistic is another question entirely. Many point out the obvious obstacles, family dynamics, lifestyle differences, and of course, security issues still hanging over everything. But the suggestion alone fueled a wave of analysis. Because for some observers, it fits a broader narrative that Harry has been navigating tensions between two worlds for years: the life he left and the life he built.
Meghan would always resented the fact that at in the Windsor Castle guest shop, there were postcards with her face on them, and they weren't receiving a kickback from that. That was what her issue was, not that they were being monetized.
And then came another comparison that stirred even more reaction. Commentators noted William is often seen surrounded by long-standing friendships from school and university, while Harry is sometimes portrayed in coverage as more isolated from those earlier circles. Whether fair or not, that observation keeps resurfacing because it taps into something people relate to: the power of community and belonging. Some say that may be one reason William often appears more settled in public perception, while Harry is frequently framed through struggle, conflict, or searching for direction. That may be simplistic, but it has become part of the conversation. And, strangely, it all loops back to the same core issue this story keeps returning to: institutions versus reinvention, security debates, fashion scrutiny, school choices, personal identity, even friendships. They all seem to feed into that bigger question. What happens when someone tries to keep one foot in institutional symbolism while building something very different outside it? That's the tension many say sits underneath all of this, because critics see patterns of commercialization where supporters see adaptation and independence. Critics see blurred boundaries where supporters see modern evolution, and neither side seems willing to give ground. That is why even topics that seem separate, police funding, designer outfits, school decisions, personal nostalgia, somehow become part of one larger narrative. And for many watching, That's what makes this story keep pulling attention. It never stays about one issue for long. A security debate becomes a debate about public money.
Well, she failed to understand that that money is there designed to help fund the royal family.
Maintain the perimeter,
Yeah.
maintain these old buildings that cost a lot of money.
Well, that's the point. That's what she complained about when she was last in Australia. Well, she got our wish.
A wardrobe discussion becomes a debate about service and branding. A school story becomes a debate about privacy, parenting, and royal values. And a report about Harry missing parts of Britain becomes a debate about identity itself. That's why the conversation keeps expanding instead of fading. Because underneath all the headlines, people aren't just arguing about one couple. They're arguing about what monarchy means in a modern age, what independence looks like after leaving the institution, and whether those two things can ever fully coexist without friction. And right now, that question still feels very unresolved. Some commentators say the deeper tension in Harry's story isn't just about headlines, it's about the life many believe he may have wanted versus the one critics say has taken shape around him. A quieter existence tied to old friendships, charity work on his own terms, and a more grounded path is often contrasted with what critics describe as a far more commercial public reality. Instead, much of the conversation now centers around branding, high-profile appearances, paid events, and growing scrutiny over whether public image has become too closely tied to business strategy. And that debate has only intensified. One story that keeps resurfacing in commentary is the Windsor Castle gift shop anecdote, often cited as revealing something larger about how commercial value may be viewed. Critics point to claims that Meghan objected not to the use of royal imagery itself, but to not sharing in the benefit from it. And for many observers, that detail became symbolic.
It's easy to contrast and compare. We don't know what went on. The people who went may have had a fabulous time, but it doesn't sound like many went. And she certainly didn't seem to be there all weekend, because I thought they were having a big weekend with her. It appears that she was out at the rugby match and out of there the next morning back to LA.
Because some argue it helps explain later moves that appeared increasingly centered on converting visibility into revenue opportunities. Whether through lifestyle ventures, curated product tie-ins, or branded experiences, critics say a pattern began taking shape. From that perspective, the issue was never commercialization alone, but control over who benefits from it. And that is where many commentators draw a sharp contrast with traditional royal thinking. For generations, the argument goes, symbolic status was understood to belong to the institution, not the individual. Public roles carried prestige, but that prestige was not meant to become a personal commercial asset. That distinction has become central to so much of the criticism. Because critics argue once symbolic authority starts being treated like a marketable product, something changes. The image is no longer only about duty or representation, it becomes part of a personal business model. And many say that's the larger controversy driving reactions now. Recent product-related criticism only fed that debate further. Commentary around luxury candles and descriptions referencing personal family details sparked strong reactions, not simply over the products themselves, but over what critics felt they represented. For supporters, these may be ordinary lifestyle branding choices. For critics, they became examples of personal symbolism being folded into commerce in ways the institution once resisted. And that disagreement goes right to the heart of this whole story. Because one side sees modern entrepreneurship, the other sees the monetization of royal association. And that divide keeps widening. Then another major issue pushed into the conversation, the visa questions. Coverage around legal review matters added an entirely different layer, because unlike image controversies, critics argued this enters a realm public relations cannot easily shape. Commentators noted that if legal review processes continue, outcomes would be determined by procedure and facts, not media narratives. That gave the issue a different seriousness. Some observers stress this is less about targeting an individual and more about whether standards are applied consistently. That point became central in much of the analysis, because for critics, the issue is framed around accountability, not celebrity. And once accountability enters the story, the tone shifts fast. What makes all of this feel even more dramatic is how many separate threads are moving at once. Security debates, commercial scrutiny, legal questions, media battles, institutional comparisons. It all seems to be converging at the same moment. And that is why some say this feels less like scattered controversy and more like a larger reckoning building in stages. Even critics who disagree on specifics often return to one comparison again and again: Catherine, because many argue her approach represents a very different philosophy of public life. The idea often repeated is simple: the work comes first. The person serves the work, not the other way around. That's why her comments about not wanting focus on wardrobe are often treated by royal watchers as something bigger than style commentary. To them, it reflects an institutional principle, and that principle has become a huge point of contrast. Because critics say when clothing or appearances remain secondary to duty, the symbolism supports the role. But when those same elements carry simultaneous commercial purpose, some argue the balance changes. And that is exactly where critics place Meghan's model, not simply as personal branding, but as a different philosophy altogether. Service supported by image versus image supporting commerce. That contrast has become one of the hardest debates to escape. Some say the late Queen saw this tension long before the public did. Supporters of that view argue the old institutional boundaries existed precisely to prevent this kind of conflict between symbolism and self-interest. And now many point to current controversies as proof those concerns were not abstract at all. That is why even small stories seem to carry oversized weight. A product listing becomes a debate about principle. A tour becomes a debate about institutional depletion. A legal review becomes a debate about accountability. Nothing stays small anymore. Everything becomes symbolic. And maybe that's because this story stopped being only about Harry and Meghan a long time ago. Now, many see it as a larger struggle over whether royal identity can be separated from commerce without consequences. And opinions on that are fierce. Some believe the criticism is unfair and rooted in resistance to change. Others believe the warnings were there from the beginning and are now playing out in plain sight. But either way, the conversation is clearly not fading, because each new controversy seems to reinforce earlier questions rather than replace them. And that is what makes the moment feel so charged. The security issue didn't end. The branding questions didn't disappear. The legal scrutiny hasn't gone away. And the comparisons inside the royal family keep getting sharper. For some observers, that creates a feeling that bigger turning points may still be ahead, especially with legal matters pending, institutional tensions unresolved, and public narratives shifting almost week by week. And through all of it, one theme keeps returning: what is public service meant to be? What is personal branding allowed to become? And can the two truly exist side by side without colliding? That may be the question sitting underneath every headline right now. Because whether critics focus on symbolic authority, commercial boundaries, or legal accountability, they are all circling the same concern. Where does public role end and personal enterprise begin? That question is still hanging over everything. And many believe that is exactly why this story keeps getting more intense, not less. Critics say one of the biggest controversies from the Australian tour was not just what happened at the events, but what some believed was happening around them. The argument they raised was stark, that humanitarian moments were not simply the focus, but in some cases may have also become part of a broader branding strategy. That is why the clothing debate kept growing. Some commentators argued the concern wasn't fashion itself, but whether emotionally serious settings were helping create commercial value around products and image. That is what made the criticism so intense, because to critics, the issue was about priorities. And once that debate started, comparisons with Catherine returned again in a major way. Supporters of the traditional royal model often point out that Catherine's wardrobe is seen as part of institutional presentation, funded for public duty, and not treated as a personal revenue stream. In that framing, the clothing serves the engagement, and any retail impact is simply a byproduct. That distinction has become central. Because critics argue the function comes first, the clothing second, and they say what troubled many observers about Meghan's tour coverage was the perception, fair or not, that this order looked reversed, that the public event created value not just symbolically, but commercially. And that is where reactions became so strong. Some critics even argued the same-day cycle of appearance, photography, and shopping attention made that perception harder to dismiss. To them, it wasn't about isolated incidents, it looked like a pattern. Supporters reject that reading and say these attacks misrepresent ordinary modern branding. But the criticism has clearly remained. And then it connected right back to the security controversy, because some observers argued these two issues are really the same debate, viewed from different angles. If public resources protect something perceived as institutional service, but private commercial benefit may also exist alongside it, critics say hard questions naturally follow. And that is exactly why reimbursement demands became such a flashpoint. It wasn't only about police costs. It was about whether public support was intersecting with private enterprise in ways many found uncomfortable. That is what made the half-in, half-out debate roar back. Because critics say at the center of it is one unresolved question: can institutional privileges continue without institutional constraints? That question has followed Harry and Meghan for years, but in Australia it seemed impossible to avoid. Some commentators even framed Harry's frustration over the security issue through that lens, saying it reflects the strain of wanting elements of institutional protection while no longer operating fully inside institutional rules. Whether fair or not, that framing has become part of the conversation. And from there, the story shifted again toward a very different contrast: Prince George's future. Reports around school planning for George sparked attention because many saw it as showing a completely different philosophy of long-term preparation. Commentators described those decisions as private, deliberate, and centered on duty, stability, and the future role George may one day carry. And many contrasted that quiet approach with the much louder commercial narratives surrounding Harry and Meghan. That comparison has only grown. Because, for some royal watchers, it reflects two very different visions of legacy. One centered on institution and continuity. The other, critics argue, increasingly shaped by media, branding, and personal enterprise. And then there's the personal side of Harry that keeps surfacing in reports. Claims that he misses old friendships, family ties, and a simpler kind of life have struck a chord with many people. Because underneath all the headlines, that feels human. The idea that someone could feel torn between public reinvention and private longing has added emotional weight to the entire story. Commentators have often pointed to William's long-standing friendships as a source of grounding, saying relationships built long before public pressures matter in ways people underestimate. And some suggest Harry may feel the absence of that more than outsiders realize. That observation keeps coming back because it touches something deeper than royal drama. It touches belonging. Who knew you before all the noise? Who remains when status fades? Who anchors you? Those questions carry weight, and some observers believe they may sit at the heart of much of Harry's reported restlessness. But then critics say another tension emerges: diverging goals. This is where some commentary becomes especially dramatic. Because critics argue Harry is sometimes portrayed as drawn toward reconciliation and quieter living, while Meghan is framed as pursuing expansion, visibility, and larger brand ambitions, whether that framing is fair is debated fiercely. But it keeps appearing, and critics say that divergence creates what they call a trap. Because one path may require reducing commercial intensity, while the other may depend on expanding it. And if both are true, some ask how those visions can coexist for long without conflict. That is where many say the story grows even more complicated. Because every new brand move critics question, every new product controversy, every new commercial rollout, they argue it potentially makes institutional repair harder. Not impossible, but harder. And that's why some believe the stakes around these decisions are bigger than they look. Because to them, it's not just about products or publicity, it's about whether each move narrows future options. And that is a much bigger story. Some even argue the real controversy isn't one candle, one tour, or one fashion listing. It's the long-term cumulative effect. Each step may seem small on its own, but together, critics say they may be shaping a very different future than the one Harry may privately want. That idea has fueled huge speculation, because if one vision points toward institutional accommodation, and another depends on maintaining distance from it, what happens then? That question hangs over everything, and maybe that is why these debates keep refusing to fade. They aren't really about clothing, or police funding, or school choices. Those are just the visible symbols of something much larger. A debate about duty versus branding, institution versus independence, reconciliation versus reinvention. And right now, many feel those tensions are becoming harder to hide. Because the more the Sussex identity is used in ways critics call commercial, the more some ask whether the path back grows narrower, and whether fair or unfair, that question has become one of the most powerful themes in this entire saga. Not just what the future looks like, but whether Harry and Meghan even want the same one anymore. And that may be the biggest question of all. Critics say the biggest tension running through all of this may be simple but impossible to ignore. Two very different visions of the future may not be able to exist side by side forever. Some commentators argue the Australian tour revealed one model clearly, a strategy built around visibility, branding, and continued commercial momentum, with Harry's Royal Association still playing a major role in that image. And many believe the coming months could test that model even more. One image many observers keep returning to is that woman on the Sydney beach who reportedly didn't react as the entourage passed by. For critics, that moment became symbolic. Not outrage, not excitement, just quiet indifference. And that, they say, may have said more than any headline. Because some saw in that small moment a wider public mood, awareness without enthusiasm, recognition without emotional investment. And that perception has fueled endless discussion about what happens if a similar model is tested in Britain, where public familiarity runs far deeper. Because Britain is different. The public there has watched Harry's story unfold for decades. There is history, affection, disappointment, sympathy, criticism, all layered together, and many believe reactions there would carry even more meaning, especially with every recent controversy becoming part of the backdrop: the security debate, the product criticism, the commercial scrutiny, the unresolved institutional questions. Critics say none of that disappears when new appearances begin. It follows, and it shapes how every new move is judged. That's why some believe the summer ahead could be especially revealing. There are so many moving parts: potential royal appearances, major sporting events, Invictus preparations, ongoing legal questions, institutional decisions still hanging in the air. Some commentators say all of it could collide in a way that makes this one of the most important periods yet. And one possibility drawing attention is the chance of overlapping US appearances involving both Harry and William. Because critics say if William appears in an official role linked to football and Harry is visible in entirely different circumstances, the contrast may be impossible to miss. One framed as institution, one framed, critics argue, through personal enterprise. And if that comparison unfolds in real time, many believe it could become a major media moment. That possibility alone has people watching closely, because this has always been, at its core, a story about competing models: duty versus reinvention, institution versus independence, service versus branding. And summer may put those contrasts on full display. Then there is George. And for many observers, he represents something else entirely: continuity. Discussion around his future schooling has carried symbolic weight because critics say it reflects long-term preparation rooted in tradition, discipline, and formation rather than publicity. And many royal watchers say that matters, because they argue institutional life is not only about titles or ceremony, it is about shaping people over decades: friendships, character, responsibility, a sense of role. Commentators say that kind of formation can't be manufactured through image strategy. It has to be lived, And that is why some say George's future keeps becoming part of this broader conversation too. Because even there, people see competing ideas about what legacy looks like. As this story moves forward, many believe one question keeps growing louder. Can commercial ambition and institutional reconciliation really move together? Or do they eventually pull in opposite directions? That may be the central question now, because some critics argue every expansion of the Sussex brand may make a return to old forms of accommodation harder, while others say reinvention is exactly the point and no return is needed. Two completely different readings. And that is why this story still grips so many people. Because it feels unresolved. Because something bigger still seems to be building. And because the next chapter may clarify a lot, will the coming months reinforce the criticisms? Will public reaction shift? Will institutional doors open or narrow even further? Will these competing visions keep colliding? A lot may depend on what happens next. And many believe the summer could be a turning point. Because if the Australian tour was a blueprint, the next stage may be the real test. And that is why so many are watching closely. What do you think about all of this? Do you think these tensions are growing, or do you see it differently? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, share this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.